The Salvation Army was founded by the Reverend William and Mrs. Catherine Booth. William was born on the 10th of April 1829 in a poor part of Nottingham. From the age of 13, he worked as a pawnbroker's assistant. And obviously in this kind of work, he was meeting very, very poor people who were forced to sell everything just to get by. I wrote this, but whether you think it's about Victorian England or now, rich people got richer, poor people got poorer. I am saying that that's what happened in Victorian times, but it may be appropriate for today. And I also wrote, if someone was too sick to go to work, they would not get paid, which perhaps echoes some of the thoughts people are saying about the NHS, even today. Children as young as 8 had to work for up to 14 hours a day. People were paid unfair wages, and there was no way out of poverty. When William Booth became a teenager, he became a Christian, and he made a promise to God. God shall have all there is of William Booth, and that is the marker for his life. Later on, he went to London, became a Methodist minister, and married Catherine and had 8 children. I'm not sure which order, but I'll let you work that one out. Catherine was a strange person. She loved God. She was a Christian. She wanted to serve him. She would happily support William in his work, but she believed that all people were equal before God. All people. She was a preacher, a minister in her own right at a time when women were persuaded or encouraged to be quiet and stay at home looking after the children. But she felt a call to preach the message of God. She also helped with alcoholics. She had her own campaigns for the poor and needy. And when she died in 1890 of cancer, she was given the term the Army Mother, as if she had given something of herself to feminize the Salvation Army. At her funeral in London, the crowds outnumbered any funeral that people could remember. And this was just a woman minister who tried to live her life for God. Now, does anybody know where the Salvation Army started?
No.
Where would you think would be the most inappropriate place?
Was it the East End?
It was the East End of London, and it was outside the Blind Beggar Pub. Now, some of you will know it because of the craze. It has a reputation for people who don't do things nicely or kindly or well. And the 2nd of July, 1865, William Booth was walking past the Blind Beggar Pub in Mile End Road, Whitechapel. And there were a group of Christians trying to tell the crowds who Jesus was and what he'd done. And they invited William Booth to come and speak to the crowds on their behalf. And that is what we would say was the birth of the Christian mission. That was the title, the term. The Salvation Army wasn't supposed to be a church, it was a mission. The aim was to tell people about Jesus and then take them to their nearest church and allow them to grow in the Christian faith. William Booth had this great desire to preach to people who would not go to church, which is a little different to perhaps the people at the time, the pastors and ministers at the time. 13 years later, in 1878, there was a report made about the Christian mission. And it described the Christian mission as a volunteer army. Now, in those days, there was a volunteer army, perhaps very similar to the territorial army today, but people ridiculed it, and it was a bit of a joke. So if you were a volunteer, it wasn't a good thing. So William Booth wrote a line across the word volunteer and put salvation. And that's where the term the Salvation Army originated from. And for some reason, this galvanized people, because people like to fight. People like to make a difference. People like to prove whatever they believe in does make a difference. And there was this fight, this war against evil, against poverty, against injustice. And people joined the Salvation Army because they wanted to be part of this organization that sought to fight sin. Even the newspaper of the Salvation Army, which goes back to 1879, is still called the War Cry. I take it around the prison when I'm visiting the prisoners, and it seems very strange. I'm going to these violent and aggressive people asking if they'd like a war cry. But again, it's our history, and it's what we're trying to do. William was very bossy, perhaps a Victorian father. And Bramwell, his son, came and said, there's an awful lot of poverty in London, a lot of people who are sleeping on the streets, a lot of people going without. And William said to his son, well, go and do something. And that's where the hostels started, and the soup runs and the food kitchens and all of those kind of social things. William Booth was a preacher, but he didn't believe you could preach when people had empty stomachs. And he said, if you're going to preach, you're going to need to fill them, to satisfy them, to meet them where they are at their particular point of need. But William wanted to do more. In the 1880s, it was discovered that match factories were paying very low wages. It sounds a bit petty, but they weren't giving their workers tea breaks, lunch breaks, and the workers tended to be the poor of society, women and children. Do you remember the book Match Girl? It's that kind of era. But these matches were made by tipping each piece of stick with yellow phosphorus, which was highly dangerous. The workers, after making so many matches, would have what was called phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, which initially became ulcers in the mouth and then would eat away at the jaw. And you're talking of women and children. We said the children would be 13, 14. They were very young. And William Booth knew there was a better way of dealing with this. People were always going to have matches. So he opened up his own factory, and they had lunch breaks and tea breaks. That sounds quite nice. They were paid a proper wage, but instead of the yellow phosphorus, he ensured they used red phosphorus. And if you look at boxes of matches, you will see the word safety matches. And that relates to it's safe for the workers. The whole point wasn't to have a match factory. It was to enable women and children to have a life that was safe and productive. And he had an awful campaign trying to get all the other match factories to copy him. It was going to be more expensive, but it was safe and it was right. And I would be surprised if you could find any yellow matches now, because the campaign at that time was successful, because people's lives are worth it, even if you have to pay a little bit more. In 1890, there was a famous book, but I can't remember who the author was, In Darkest Africa and the Way Out. And it was a survey of all the problems of Africa and how things could be improved. But Victorian Britain wasn't a good place. So in 1890, William Booth wrote his own book, In Darkest England and the Way Out. And he set his beliefs, his hopes, his agenda on making Britain a different kind of place to what it was in Victorian Britain. He set up a farm colony so that people could be moved from the cities to a more beneficial environment where they could learn skills and work the land. The farm colony is still going in Hadley in Essex, and it's open to the public. The Olympics, when it was in Britain, used their land for the cycle racing. And it's just trying to prove that everybody matters, everybody counts. He set up a missing persons bureau where people could find lost relatives. He created more hostels for the homeless and set up a poor man's bank so that workers could borrow some money to set up a trade. Within 9 years, the Salvation Army served 27 million cheap meals, traced 18,000 missing people, provided shelter for 11 million homeless people, found jobs for 9,000 unemployed people. We still have what we started when we began was a labour exchange. You'd have to be a certain age to remember that. They're called job centres now, but when the Salvation Army started them, they were labour exchanges. But we have in our church what is called Employment Plus, and the people who find it the hardest to get a job come to us, and we will work with them and train them and see how we can get them back into employment for their sake. Now, when the Salvation Army became the Salvation Army, we started using military terms. It was just the way it was. People enjoyed the fight. So we didn't have church members and ministers. We had soldiers and officers. We don't sing hymns, we sing songs. We don't put money into the offertory plate. We fire a cartridge. Sounds good fun, doesn't it? Yeah. Christians don't die. They are promoted to glory. All the normal church terms that you can think of are rephrased into military terms, but with a Christian element. We have uniforms, we have flags, we have a burning desire to share faith. At Christmas, you'll often find a Salvation Army band, either on the street or outside a shopping centre. In some ways, it sort of changed from a church organ to a brass band in services, but that wasn't the initial requirement. The first Salvation Army band was a family, the Fry family in Coventry. And when the Salvation Army went onto the streets to tell people about Jesus, the band would gather around the preacher, because the band were not the musicians, they were the bodyguards, because people didn't like the Salvation Army. Things were thrown, things were said, and the band would offer some sort of protection. Do you remember the ladies' bonnets? Again, they weren't supposed to be attractive headgear for ladies. They were like crash helmets. They were purely there to protect ladies from being hit or attacked, because unfortunately, there was a lot of violence. The Salvation Army, I suppose because of its Methodist roots, are strict teetotal. So if you go back to Victorian England and people are having cheap gin or whatever, and they become a member of the Salvation Army, it means they stop drinking. So the people in the pub trade were losing their trade. So when the Salvation Army were in the streets, you would find the landlords having a bit of a gang mentality, trying to hurt the people on the streets. For some reason, city and town politicians would join them, and there was many attacks. Sometimes Salvationists were killed, many times they were imprisoned because of their Christian faith. But it's due to the money that some people were losing. The landlords and the city and town officials decided to do something, and they invented the skeleton army. So the Salvation Army would be there talking about Jesus, trying to get people to have a good life. And every time one of the Salvation Army people spoke, you would see a group of thugs with their skeleton flag trying to bring disruption and cause aggravation. It's not very good, but it's what it was of the time. William wanted to make a difference, but making a difference causes problems. People like what it is, like what they've got, like the circumstances, even if they're not perfect. At the time, it was legal to abuse underage children. That was the law. And William Booth had this thing that children should be protected. If you're a Christian, you go back to the teachings of Jesus, and he says you should care for children. And prostitutes between 13 and 16 were often seen just as a thing, as something to own, something to use, and something to throw away. So he started this campaign, the Maiden Tribute campaign. He had lots of signatures. He went to Parliament. He did everything he could to raise the age limit from 13 to 16. That age limit is still at 16 because of William Booth, but obviously in our modern age, people talk about going down or whatever because teenagers are more modern than they used to be, more clever than they used to be. It was called white slavery. 13 to 16-year-old girls were of no value except to people who could make money from them or people who could sleep with them. He wanted to make a difference. His faith said, you do not just be nice to people, you have to change when there is something wrong. On the 9th of May 1912, General William Booth, as he called himself, made his final speech at the Royal Albert Hall in London. And these are his words. He was 83 and blind. And now, comrades, I must say goodbye. I'm going into dry dock for repairs, but the army will not be allowed to suffer either financially or spiritually or in any other way by my absence. And in the long future, I think it will be seen. I shall not be here to see, but you will be, that the army will answer every doubt, banish every fear, strangle every slander, and by its marvelous success, show the world that it is the work of God and that the general has been his servant. While women weep as they do now, I'll fight. While little children go hungry as they do now, I'll fight. While men go to prison in and out, as they do now, I'll fight. While there is one drunkard left, while there is a poor lost girl upon the streets, while there remains one dark soul without the light of God, I'll fight. I'll fight to the very end. He was promoted to glory on the 20th of August, 1912. And by that time, the Salvation Army had spread to 50 countries, setting up churches and Christian programs wherever they could. It was strange. When I went to prison this year, when I started to go to prison, a couple of people recognized me in my uniform and they asked, "Aren't you a Booth's boy?" And I'm thinking, well, Booth died in 1912. How do you know? But there's something that of him seems to resonate with people. The Salvation Army still continues to work with the homeless, with street teams, advice centres, breakfast, lunches, life houses, anywhere so that homeless people can get some support, some friendship, perhaps a second chance. When there is a fire, flood, earthquake, or a bomb explosion, the Salvation Army is quickly at the scene of these events. We have special emergency vans and teams of people serving hot drinks and refreshments for the emergency services and the victims of these events. We have 62 centres in the UK where people who have no place to stay can shelter, but it's more than just a bed for the night. These centres help people learn new skills, deal with their problems, build confidence in themselves. They support them in finding a job and a home of their own. The Salvation Army believes strongly in putting faith into action. As a Christian church, the Salvation Army believes in a God who loves every single person. He created every person, and Jesus said he came so that every single person could have life, abundant life. Because of circumstance or family or finance, people shouldn't be penalised and have a second-class life.